All right, good morning and hello everyone, and welcome to yet another video looking at some exam style questions for Unit 3, AOS3, Australia and the world economy. Coming to you today because I had two requests yesterday, one for a question about the terms of trade and one for a question based on trade liberalization. So I've thrown two of those together, kind of tweaking past exam questions to be more modern. Then we're going to look at how you go about answering those, how I think the mark breakdown would go for those, and then looking at sample answers that I have come up with. So hopefully this has helped you. Like I said before, if you have any requests for anything similar to this, let me know. I'm more than happy to try and throw some things together. One of the upsides of remote learning is I've got a tiny bit more time where I can throw these kind of things together, where I lose out on travel time to and from work. But it's great to know if these things are helping you out. So we're going to go straight into what our key knowledge that we're looking at today. So we're going to be looking at the effective movements of the terms of trade on the current account balance, domestic macroeconomic goals, and living standards. In this case, we're going to go straight into how the terms of trade affects the current account balance, or how it should affect the current account balance. And then we're also going to look at the effect of trade liberalization on living standards. And we're going to modernize a question to try and make it relevant to our current setting. So the key skills that line up with that is how to explain key international economic relationships and how that may affect living standards. If we're looking at that right now, that's going to be like China in all caps, just like the things they are doing and how that affects us. Then the usual explain trends, patterns, similarities, and differences in economic data and information, as well as access and interpret, draw conclusions from information gathered from a range of sources. So hopefully that means that you are bringing to your answers some things you know from the wider world, which hopefully you are paying attention to, as the world is a big dumpster fire of a mess. So let's get into our first question, which is explain the likely impact of a favorable movement in the terms of trade on the balance of current account. Like I mentioned in the last question we looked at with the current account, I'm predicting that VCAR is going to be using that phrasing, the balance of current account, rather than current account deficit as it says in the study design. And that is because we are currently in a current account surplus. Not many of the textbooks refer to that because they are out of date, unless you have the CPAP textbook, which is updated yearly. That is going to be really, really important that you know we are in a current account surplus. That is going to separate you from students who aren't as smart as you, because hopefully you're very smart, or hopefully after watching this you are smarter. So explain the likely impact of a favorable movement in the terms of trade on the balance of current account. Your first mark is going to come from describing that favorable movement in the terms of trade. So it's kind of like slightly defining what the terms of trade is by describing what a favorable movement in the terms of trade is. So a favorable movement in the terms of trade, and one really important thing to talk about is to have a favorable movement in terms of trade. It means that there's either an increase to the export price index or a decrease to the import price index. We don't know in this case. So that's really, really important. I should call that XPI because that's how we do exports and that's how we do imports. But that's really important. That's either of those. You have to be like, that's either we've got an increase to the export price index and or a decrease to the import price index. That is a favorable movement. If you don't talk about both of those things, technically you're not fully correct, because you need to mention that, because you don't know for sure. If one changes, you don't necessarily know what happens to the other. So therefore you need to talk about both of them. If you say a favorable movement in the terms of trade is when there is an increase in the export price index on average, well, that's not technically right, because if the import price index increased at a greater rate, your increase in the export price index hasn't actually had an impact and has actually been negative overall. So that's very, very, very important. So that's talking about what that is, describing that favorable movement. And then from that, you've got to talk about how that would lead to either increased credits in the balance of goods and services / decreased debits based on the cheaper imports overall. So this is essentially your effect on sub-accounts. In the current account. So that's very important. And it's going to be really important that when you go from that step, with the terms of trade, when it has favorable movements or unfavorable movements, we are assuming that the demand or the holding values, which we sometimes use as terminology, is constant, which means that although the terms of trade has changed, terms of trade is a demand side factor. It's not affecting the overall quantity demanded. It just means that changes in it represent more or less demand in the economy. So therefore, when there is a favorable movement in the terms of trade, it means we are either on average receiving higher prices for our exports or on average paying less for our imports, which therefore means we're getting more credits in the balance of goods and services or less debits going out in the balance of goods and services, which obviously affects those sub-accounts in the current account. And then to get to the overall impact, that's going to mean that we are going to have an increase in the current account surplus, or if you're talking historically, like if this is just general theoretically, that would mean a reduction in a current account deficit. If you had a question like this, which you're talking about recently, and it's like tying to real world events, you talk about that increasing our current account surplus, because that is where we are right now. So to get into my sample answer for this, the terms of trade is an index measuring average price for exports relative to the average price paid for our imports. I stole that directly from a VCAR examiner's report, so therefore they have to accept it. I like to do that because taking things from their sample answers shows things that they are definitely giving marks. If there is a favorable movement in the terms of trade, this means that a higher average price is received for any given volume of exports sold. Assuming that holding values are constant, an increase in the prices we receive for exports on average will decrease, or a decrease in the average price we pay for our imports would increase credits and decrease debits from the balance of goods and services in the current account. This would then lead to either an increase in the overall current account surplus or a decrease in the current account deficit. What's important in the kind of like the terminology here, because I also took this sentence from VCAR, I'd probably adjust it a little bit if I was writing it to be safer. But because I said if there is a favorable movement in the terms of trade, it means that a higher average price is received for any given volume of exports sold. Basically, that's kind of meaning like relative to. I would prefer that sentence to say if there's a favorable movement in terms of trade, this means that either a higher average price is received for any given volume of exports sold, or we are paying a lower price for any given volume of imports purchased. I feel like that would be better overall. I would definitely include that in an answer to be safe. Then to get into our second question, we have discuss how a move away from trade liberalization in countries due to the COVID-19 pandemic may impact on living standards. So a very current, relevant question. This is really trying to dive into some current events, tying into what's happening between Australia and China. So one mark, you're going to be describing the move away from trade liberalization. So obviously you're probably going to define what trade liberalization is, but you're going to be describing why we've been moving away from it, which is kind of like talking in generally why countries are internalizing a little bit during the pandemic, or in this case, China instating trade barriers, etc. One mark you're going to get for positives of this for living standards. You have negatives for this. And your last mark is going to be your links to living standards, so material and non-material. This is like your general with any discussed question, it's strengths and weaknesses and making sure you tie it into the actual thing. So with this, we'll just get straight into the sample answer because it makes it far more clear overall. But trade liberalization represents the removal of barriers to trade between nations and a move towards freer trade. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic and ongoing disputes between Australia and China, there has been a move away from trade liberalization and an increase in trade barriers. Very specific ties it to recent events without being too over the top. One advantage of a move away from trade liberalization for Australia is that it can create more employment locally as domestic businesses are not faced with as much international competition due to barriers such as tariffs and quotas, and therefore are more able to remain profitable, which will then lead to living standards being maintained as workers maintain their incomes and do not need to be stressed about the future. That's a little bit more about the internalizing of things, like as borders kind of close, countries need to produce things in their country. However, a disadvantage of a move away from trade liberalization is that Australia often relies on cheaper imports or relatively cheaper imports from foreign nations as a source of inputs for production. A move away from trade liberalization can then lead to an increase in the cost of production for businesses, which may lead to businesses laying off workers, increasing structural unemployment. This will lead to a reduction in material living standards as workers have a reduced income, and lowered non-material living standards as they feel more stressed about their future. So both of these things tie into both material and non-material living standards very, very quickly. Stress is such an easy non-material one to bring up in this case, but it's all about pointing out the pros and cons of the moving away from trade liberalization. So why protectionist policies can be good in some ways and then ways that they can be bad. That's what I've done for this. There's many, many different ways you can answer this question and still be fully correct, as long as you bring in some of those reasons why countries use protectionist policies and why some of the benefits of what they benefit, so they also benefit young industries, just so they don't have to compete internationally until they get on their feet, but then also specifically having some disadvantages of them. You have less choice as a non-material factor being really, really important there. But that's essentially it for these two questions. So I hope they were helpful. As always, thank you for watching my oddly specific presentation about exam style questions, in this case, more exam style questions. This one looking at the terms of trade and trade liberalization. I hope this was helpful. If you have any other requests for anything else, please let me know. Check out my website, therunningeconomy.com. I posted that blog that I talked about, really ripping into Harvey Norman and Jerry Harvey. I didn't get blocked by them on Twitter, but their Twitter account also disappeared, so a bit of a disappointment there. Great meme in that blog post though, so I highly recommend checking that out. I'm thinking about doing some work on Unit 3 revision in general coming up, especially Area Study 1, so if anything like that sounds good to you, let me know specifically what you'd like help with. Other than that, I hope you have a wonderful day, that you are getting through lockdown as best you can, and I will see you in the near future. Have a wonderful day. Goodbye.